And so to introduce John, John is the chairman of the Reptile Amphibian group for Somerset. And he has been helping the Wildlife Trust for many, many years, leading all sorts of wonderful wildlife walks and training in adder survey techniques. And he's also coordinated the Mendip pond project, which I'll probably tell you a little bit about, but it's very successful in creating a lot of new habitat on Mendip, specifically targeting great crested newts in this neck of the woods. Here on Mendip, sorry, I should say neck of the hills. If I stop sharing my screen, John, thank you so much for giving us your time again tonight. And if you try sharing yours, hopefully it'll work beautifully.
There we are. Can everybody see that?
Moment of truth.
Well, thank you, Lila. And welcome everybody to the pond creation workshop. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run through this talk, first of all, on creating ponds. And then I think if anybody's put questions in the chat box at the end, I can try to answer them. Lila did say, would I say something about the Mendip pond project? And I will, but rather briefly, because it's not really part of the agenda for tonight. But I'm going to start. Oh, Lila, I can't move my screen on.
Okay, well, maybe I can try sharing your presentation and move the screen on if you tell me when to move it on.
John, sometimes you need to sort of click back onto the sort of slides themselves and then try it again and maybe use the arrows and see if that works.
Ah, yes, okay.
There you go.
Okay, so just very briefly, a little bit of information about the Mendip Pond project, because the reason that Lila and Pippa have asked me to do this workshop is not because I'm any great expert on ponds, really. I don't claim to be. There's plenty of people that know a lot more about ponds than I do, but I am quite enthusiastic about ponds, mainly because of my interest in amphibians. And the pond project on the Mendips arose from my interest in amphibians, really. And the fact that there's some wonderful ponds on the Mendips, these beautiful little stone-built things, some of which date back about 200 years. Which at one time would have been excellent habitat for not just great crested newts, but all sorts of species of newts. But great cresteds are the ones that are of greatest conservation concern. So what we wanted to do was to restore ponds that were providing no habitat at all for great crested newts, such as the one that you can see here, back to some sort of useful habitat. Some sort of useful habitat for the species, and create a sort of network of ponds that they could use as stepping stones to move across the landscape. And we got a grant from the lottery to restore a number of these ponds. And the response from people when we appealed for volunteers was absolutely extraordinary. A lot of people seem to be very interested in these ponds. And we had the wonderful Tina Barth, who some of you may be familiar with, doing the actual reconstruction of the ponds. Once we had cleared them all out and got rid of all the muck and the silt and everything that was in there, and you can see it was quite a dirty job. But gradually, we are getting quite a large network of ponds restored. All of the money from the lottery got spent a long time ago, but having spent it, the cost really was in the actual construction, the reconstruction of the derelict ponds. But just because we blew all the money doesn't mean we finished the project. We still are carrying on. And what we're doing now is we're targeting ponds that are in good enough condition that they can be just emptied of all of the rubbish and the silt and everything else that's clogging them up, and then provide some sort of a useful habitat for great crested newts. They didn't all need complete reconstruction. So we plod on, really. The COVID thing hasn't helped. We've only been able to get 6 people out at a time in the last year or so, but that seems to be lifting. And hopefully we'll be able to carry on doing some more of these restorations. So a little bit of a plug. If anybody's interested, we're always looking for volunteers to come pond digging. I have to warn you, it's very hard work and it's very dirty. But let's put that aside and look at how you create ponds rather than restore them. The first thing is to try and define a pond. Now that's a little bit difficult. There is no sort of hard and fast definition of what a pond is, but they're generally understood to be small water bodies, smaller than a lake. And generally that can mean anything between sort of a square meter in surface area and something up to 2 hectares, at which point most people would start to classify it as a lake rather than a pond. Clearly they need to hold water, but they don't necessarily need to hold water for 12 months of the year. Seasonal ponds are important ponds for a lot of wildlife, ponds that dry out in high summer, for example. And they can come in all different shapes and sizes and all different designs, if you want to call it that. I've put a sort of representative sample here. The one on the right, the circular one, is one of these man-made ponds up on the Mendips, like I was just showing you that we've been restoring. I would describe that as a dew pond, although the term is a little bit deceptive because it's not filled by dew, it's filled by rain and runoff from the fields. But it's accepted as what people generally refer to as a dew pond. The one in the middle is something probably that somebody who keeps koi carp or a valuable collection of fishes might build. It's not a wildlife pond in any sense, but it's nevertheless a pond. And the one on the left is quite an interesting one because it's what I would describe as a natural pond. And what I mean by that is simply that it's unlined. So the other two would be lined. The one in the middle would probably be lined by plastic, some sort of a butyl or something liner. The one on the right, the dew pond, would be lined with cobblestones. But the other one that I'm describing as natural, I think I need to sort of define what natural is at the moment, because it's very difficult to know whether a pond is truly natural. Obviously, geological movements and things has created ponds since the year dot. But most of the ponds these days that are around the landscape that we might describe as natural ponds actually aren't natural. They're excavations that have been created somewhere by people. And just by chance are filled up with water because they happen to be on a heavy clay bed or something like that. And it's almost impossible in some cases to tell whether a pond has been excavated at some point or whether it's actually the result of natural earth movement. So when I talk about natural ponds, what I mean really is ponds that are unlined and are holding water simply because of the geology of the area where they are. So that's a sort of representative sample of what a pond is. Why are ponds important? Ponds are massively important. The only habitat we have in Britain that is more diverse in terms of species is the sea. Ponds are hugely biodiverse. There's an awful lot of creatures that are, first of all, dependent on ponds, but also an awful lot of creatures that are using ponds that may not be necessarily dependent on. Put all those two groups of species together and you get an awful lot of creatures, or an awful lot of species, creatures and plants, using ponds. There was a national pond survey in 1998 and it recorded over 400 species of plants and 398 species, so nearly 400 species of macroinvertebrates. Now these are invertebrates, these are large invertebrates. They don't include all of the microscopic invertebrates, which probably would outnumber the macroinvertebrates by quite a long way. So an enormous number of species using or dependent on ponds. There's 150 species of invertebrates listed in the UK Red Data Book. And of them, I can't see, oh, sorry, I can't see the number because Pippa Rayner's picture is over the top of it. But whatever the number is there, if people can see it, only that number I found only in ponds. I believe it's quite a high number. So an awful lot of red data book species, which means actually rare species of invertebrates, are found only in ponds. And in Schedules 5 and 6 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, these are the schedules that contain protected species. Schedule 5 is protected animals and Schedule 8 is protected plants. 60% of those that are listed are found in ponds, so the majority actually. So that's why ponds are important in the first place. But why create one? Well, the reason that I like to think is the best reason for creating ponds is simply because so many have disappeared. Oliver Rackham may be familiar to some of you. He's a very good historian of the British countryside, and he used sort of fairly detailed analysis of Ordnance Survey maps from 1880, and he estimated that in England and Wales, excluding Scotland, in 1880 there were somewhere like 800,000 ponds in the wider countryside. There was a similar survey in the 1920s. They estimated that that number had gone down to 340,000. And in 1996, a similar survey again estimated that it had gone down to about 300,000. So a huge decline in just little over 100 years. We had lost almost 2/3 of the ponds in Britain. The reasons for pond loss are many and varied, but essentially they're because farm ponds were the ones that were being lost at the greatest rate. And farm ponds were originally installed, or the vast majority of them were originally installed for watering livestock. And with the introduction of piped water into proper drinking troughs, they became obsolete. And so they were taking up space that could have been otherwise put to some use like growing grass or something like that. So once they became obsolete, the farmers didn't really want them anymore and started filling them in or plowing them over. And then in the 1950s, there was actually government subsidies to farmers to fill in ponds and get rid of them. Now, of course, we recognize that this huge loss of ponds directly reflects the loss of the species that are reliant on ponds. So there's quite a lot of effort now in this country to restore or put back the ponds that have been lost over this relatively short period of time. So there's the incentive. First of all, the fact that they're so biodiverse, there's so many species reliant on ponds, and secondly, the fact that so many have disappeared. What sort of wildlife can you expect to find in ponds? Well, it depends a bit on the pond, and I'm going to talk a little bit about different types of ponds in a moment. But a pond doesn't need to be large to attract wildlife. Even the smallest ponds are going to have a variety of species that are going to use them. But ponds, there are different types of ponds. Ponds with different characteristics and different features will attract a different, if you like, a different suite of species. Some ponds are permanent. They hold water all year round. Some of them are seasonal, and so they usually will dry out in most summers, maybe all summers. And some are what you might consider semi-permanent, so they may only dry out one summer in 5 or one summer in 10 or whatever. Ponds may be shaded, they might be woodland ponds, or they may be out in the open. This will give them a very different character, and it will attract a different suite of species. The other characteristic that can determine what suite of species a pond's going to attract is the stage of succession. Ponds at early succession, an early successional stage, have a lot of open water. What I mean by a successional stage is how a pond matures and ages. So if you dig a hole and you don't do anything else, you don't maintain it, and that hole fills up with water and becomes a pond, it'll be very different in the early years than it is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years further on. It changes, the character of it changes, and it goes through what are described as stages of succession. I'll talk a lot about the early stages of succession when I talk about actually building a pond, but the basic of the sort of longevity of a pond or the life of a pond is simply that you start with this big hole that's full of water, with lots of open water, lots of deep water, and gradually over time it all starts to fill up with silt, and once it starts to get very full of silt, then big emergent, deep water emergent plants might take over the entire surface area of the pond because you haven't got a great deal of depth anymore, and that will accelerate the silting up of the pond, and eventually it just becomes a bog, an area of bog. By this time you've probably got trees that have rooted into it, and they're going to take the last bit of remaining water out of it, and eventually you end up with dry land again. That's the sort of life cycle of a pond. Where a pond is in that in those phases of succession is going to have a huge impact on which species are going to be used. Now, most people, when they create a pond, want to create what you might describe as a classic permanent pond. Most people don't want a pond that's going to dry out every summer. In fact, most people don't want a pond that's going to dry out periodically, one summer in 5 or one summer in 10. Most people want something permanent, and that's fine. They're very useful ponds for wildlife. But it's important to understand that they are just one type of pond, and so they will attract one suite of species. They won't attract everything. If you wanted to create a semi-permanent or a seasonal pond, then you would attract all sorts of other species as well. So they all have their own sort of characteristics and their own groups of species that are used. So my comments are predominantly going to be about a sort of classic permanent pond, really, because I think that's what most people are going to be looking to create. So what sort of animals might you expect to attract? Well, I could do a talk in its own right on that, because there's such a huge number of creatures that could be attracted by a pond, but I've tried to select a sort of relatively representative sample here. The majority of the wildlife that a pond is going to attract, at least animals, I'm not talking about plants here, are going to be invertebrates, so insects and snails and things like that. With a nice permanent pond, you might expect to see some dragonflies moving in, water beetles. You may get snails moving in, probably not as quickly as things like dragonflies and water beetles, because obviously they can fly in, so they will be attracted to quite early succession ponds. But snails are colonizers. They will come in eventually, usually on the feet of ducks or herons or something like that, which brings me to birds. You also will find you can probably attract herons. A lot of people don't particularly want to attract herons because they're eating all the other wildlife in the pond, but they're part of it, so they have a place in it. You can expect, I would imagine, to attract amphibians, so frogs. Frogs seem to find ponds fairly quickly. If you're lucky, you may attract great crested newts, which is what you've got in the centre there. And if you've got amphibians established in your pond, then you can expect the predators of amphibians to move in as well. So the grass snakes and things like that, which specialise in feeding on amphibians, are likely to turn up fairly soon after the amphibians do. And you might even attract the odd mammal. So bats are quite attracted to ponds because you get big clouds of gnats. Gnats breed in ponds, and so on nice warm evenings they sort of gather over the top of the water in big clouds, and the bats will come in and feed on them. And bats will also drink out of ponds as well. So I could go on forever with this, but there is a huge number of animals that will be attracted to a permanent pond. It obviously depends a little bit on what lives in your vicinity anyway. If you get great crested newts moving into the pond, and they are considered by some people to be the sort of cream of the cream, the target species to get moving into a pond. A lot of people want to see great crested newts, but you're not going to be able to attract them unless they live in the area where you're building the pond anyway. They're not terribly good dispersers, really. They disperse fairly short distances. So you will get what's already living around you. That's what you will attract. But there's a huge number of things that you will attract. So once you've decided to construct a pond, there's going to be a few questions. The first one will be where to put it. What's the best place? Probably the best bit of advice, really, is that ponds need sunlight. Or they don't need sunlight. You can have woodland ponds, which are quite useful, but they're not as biodiverse as ponds that do get sunlight. Ponds that get a lot of sunlight have good growth of macrophytes, of plant life. And that is the basis of any food chain, really. So once you've got that, then you're going to attract an awful lot more stuff. So giving a pond a lot of sunlight is a good idea. It's a little bit ambiguous, because once you've got a pond in full sunlight, then you'll probably spend quite a lot of time trying to shade it with plants, which I'll come to later. I'll talk about the planting of a pond once I've spoken about constructing it in the first place. But generally speaking, a site in full sun for most of the day is the best site for a pond. If you've got a lot of trees overhanging the pond, it creates two problems. First of all, it blocks a lot of sunlight, particularly if you've got large trees to the south of the pond, because the south is where most of the sunlight's going to come from. But apart from blocking light, also you're going to get a lot of leaf fall in the autumn, and that's all going to gather in the pond and create a huge amount of silt. And before it creates the silt, it creates a lot of nutrients, because it breaks down in the water and releases nitrates into the water. And as we'll see later, one of the principal sort of maintenance tasks, if you like, on a pond is to try and reduce the amount of nutrients going into the water. So you don't want a huge amount of leaf litter going in and breaking down if you can help it. Other considerations when deciding on where to put your pond is how deep the water table is. Now, this is going to make a difference to whether or not your pond needs to be lined. And if I had £1 for every time that someone said, oh, I don't need to line my pond because we've got this boggy little wet corner in a field, which will be perfect. And then they dig it out and they find they've got a seasonal pond, because it's not a boggy little wet corner all the year through. It just happens to be most of the time. So water tables are very variable. They rise and fall. And if you're not planning to line the pond in any way, then you need to be very sure that the water table is going to be high enough throughout the year to enable you to have a permanent pond, if that's what you want. If you're happy with a seasonal pond, then that's fine. It doesn't matter if the water table drops. But if the water table does drop and it's a permanent pond you want, then the chances are you're going to have to line in some way. And we'll look at different ways of doing that in a while. Another consideration might be where the nearest water supply is. As we'll see in a bit, it's not perfect to fill a new pond with tap water. If you can avoid doing that and you can leave the pond to fill naturally from rainwater, then that's a better option. But not many people can, and particularly if you are lining a pond with butyl or some other sort of rubber liner, then you may need to fill it immediately that it's been lined in order to hold the liner in place. So where the water supply is in relation to the pond may be an important consideration for you. So you want it somewhere where you want to site your pond somewhere where you can get mains water and a hose pipe to it, if that is what you are going to need to do. So I think those are the main considerations when looking for a site to put a pond in. And then the next question is planning permission. Most people forget about this. And to be quite honest, I've never met anybody who's put in for planning permission to put a pond in And neither have I ever met anybody who's had to go and get retrospective planning permission to put a pond in. I've never heard it being a problem. However, planning permission technically should be applied for in the case of most ponds. If you are digging a pond by hand, then no planning permission is required, presumably because they take the view that a pond dug by hand is going to be relatively small. But if you're using machinery, if you get a digger in to create a pond, then it becomes an engineering operation. And in that case, planning permission is technically required. However, if you are getting a digger in and it technically becomes an engineering operation, then you may be able to make the case that it's agricultural work, depending on where you are putting a pond in. If you're putting it in your garden, you might struggle to do that. But if you're putting it in a field or something like that, you may be able to argue agricultural work, in which case it's exempt from planning permission. So my advice really would be to speak to your planning officer in advance. I can't possibly advocate that you don't bother with it at all, although I don't think many people do. But ideally, speak to your planning officer. Just be aware that planning permission is necessary if you're digging a pond using equipment to do so. There is one other thing to add to this, and that is if ponds are going to be dug close to watercourses, that introduces a whole other layer of permission. If you are planning to put a pond in within 10 meters of a watercourse, then you need to consult with one of two organizations. If it's a major river, then you need to consult with the Environment Agency. They need to, apart from the planning permission itself from the local council, the Environment Agency also need to give permission for a construction within 10 meters of a major river. If it's a smaller watercourse, like a small stream or here in Somerset, Means, for example, these two you need to consult, but in that case you need to consult with your local internal drainage board and your I think each district council has an internal drainage board. They're responsible for small watercourses, so in that case streams and means. And again, if you're putting anything in within 10 meters of one of these smaller watercourses, you need to get in touch with the internal drainage board, and your local council will be able to tell you how to get in touch with them. So either it's going to be the Environment Agency for big rivers or the drainage board for small watercourses. Far easier just to keep them beyond 10 meters from any watercourse. If you are planning to divert a stream or something to feed your pond, then you would undoubtedly need to get in touch with one of those two organisations to ask permission there. But actually, I would advise in the case of wildlife ponds against diverting watercourses to fill them. Wildlife ponds are better as discrete ponds rather than part of any other water body. The main reason for that is that if you start connecting your pond up to other water bodies, you're likely to introduce fish. And fishes and wildlife ponds don't really mix. Fishes tend to go around and eat everything in a wildlife pond. So if you want to attract the greatest diversity of wildlife, you will need to exclude fish. There's a lot of species that won't live alongside fish. And fish spend their entire time eating all of the invertebrates and things that are making up the base of the food chain. So the fishes, I would advise against fishes in a wildlife pond. And for that reason, I would advise against feeding a pond from another watercourse, because even if it's just little fish like sticklebacks, they're going to get in to a pond. And if you're also planning on just widening a stretch of a stream to produce a sort of pool on a stream rather than a discrete pond, this will be a very different type of pond than the ones that I'm describing tonight. they're usually these little sort of pools on streams, don't have a great longevity because they become silt traps. And running water coming down the stream will be picking up silt as it comes down, and then it gets to the pool and the speed of the water flow slows and all of that silt just settles out into your pool. And very quickly you find that the maintenance becomes overwhelming, and your pond very quickly silts up and just becomes a stream again. They're not really suitable as wildlife ponds. So what I'm talking about tonight are discrete ponds that will be fed either by you topping them up with your tap, or alternatively by rain and perhaps runoff from surrounding land. So once you've sorted out the planning permission, the next thing you're going to have to think about is the shape of the pond, and more importantly, the profile of the pond. The profile is absolutely critical. You want some areas that are going to be deep, at least deep enough not to freeze right through. My advice for most circumstances would be that you would want areas of the pond that go down to about a meter's depth. Now that's important because you're going to likely have some animals that are going to spend the winter in the pond. And ponds go into a fairly deep dormancy in the winter. Everything that lives in the pond goes into essentially a hibernation. And a lot of these things are going to be hibernating in the bottom of the pond. And ponds have different water temperatures at different depths. You get a zonation of temperature from the bottom upwards. And water is at its densest at 4 degrees. So this is the heaviest it becomes, the densest it becomes. So water at 4 degrees sits at the bottom of the pond. If you've got about a meter of depth, then you can be fairly sure that the water at the bottom of the pond is going to remain at 4 degrees, no matter what happens above the pond, whether it's freeze, whether it's iced over on the top in the winter, or whether it's warmer at the top in summer. The water at the bottom of the pond, once you go down to about a meter, is going to remain at about 4 degrees. It's great for animals that are hibernating there because it provides the thermal stability that they need. So for that reason, I would advise that at least one area of the pond, probably the middle, goes down to about a meter. Other than that, you can play around with various depths. But an important thing to say about the depths, other than the maximum one, is that the more shallow areas you have, the greater diversity of wildlife you're likely to attract, because a lot of pond invertebrates live in the shallow water. The shallow water is often the warmest water in summer when you have a lot of life in the pond. And so a lot of invertebrates are going to be using those sort of warm shallows. So the more shallow water you can produce, the better. The other thing is, if you've got nice sloping sides, providing lots of different depths, then when you do get a dry spell in the summer, what you will get is what's called a drawdown zone, because your water level is going to decrease in a warm part of the summer. You're going to get a lot of evaporation and one thing or another. So you're going to lose water, it's inevitable. But it's not a problem, because it will create this area called a drawdown zone, which is, if you like, the area between high water and low water. And if you've got vertical sides, then that may only be a few inches, and it'll be pretty useless to wildlife because it's those few inches of drawdown zone are vertical. If you've got nice sloping sides, then although the pond may only have dropped maybe 6 inches, the actual drawdown zone, because it's almost horizontal in some areas, perhaps if you've got very shallow water most of the time, is going to be quite wide. And this provides opportunities for a whole other suite of species that like this drawdown zone. So shallow water and wide drawdown zones, which you get from very gently sloping edges, are good. The more different depths that you can create, the better. So have a think about what sort of profile you want your pond to have and how you can provide areas that are deep, down to about a metre, and areas that give you lots of shallower parts and drawdown zones that are going to be wide. And you may even consider putting a sort of bar through the middle or something like that if you've got a big pond, to provide sort of shallow water further out, rather than just having the sort of obvious sloping edges. You can create shallow areas in other parts of the pond as well with a bit of creativity. The depth of the pond does affect the oxygenation of the pond. There's two ways that oxygen can get into the water. By far the most important is the surface area. Oxygen diffusing into the pond from the atmosphere. That's how most of the oxygen is going to get into your pond, and oxygen is vital in the pond. So you need a large surface area. The larger the surface area, the better. In order to make sure that you've got sufficient oxygenation right the way through the entire water column down to the bottom of the pond, you need to have a surface area that's at least 5 times the maximum depth. So if you've got a maximum depth of a metre, then your minimum surface area needs to be 5 square metres in order to ensure that the pond is properly oxygenated. And if you've got animals hibernating in the bottom of the pond and things like that, then oxygenation down to the bottom is very important. And as we'll see when we look at water chemistry, oxygen is extremely important to maintain that as well. So those are the key things, I think, that are going to be at the forefront of your mind when you're considering the shape and the profile. And profile, as I say, is more important than shape. You can put it whatever shape you like. So then the next question is whether or not you're going to need to filter your pond. In a wildlife pond, there are no circumstances where it's necessary to filter a pond. The pond becomes its own little ecosystem and will maintain its own water quality. If you were somebody who kept a collection of ornamental fishes, a koi keeper, for example, then you would be looking at a very different circumstance. And in that situation, you would need some fairly heavy-duty filtration to maintain the quality of the water. And when I say quality of the water, I mean the chemistry, the water chemistry. There's two things that you might want to control, I suppose, if that's the right word, in your pond, as far as water quality is concerned. One, and by far the most important, is the chemistry, the chemical makeup of the water. And the other is the clarity. And by clarity, all I mean is how easy it is to see through the water, how clear it is. If you're a fish keeper, then that's quite important. For a wildlife pond, it's less so. And there may be periods of time where the water clarity is temporarily lost. The water may, for example, turn green in early spring. That happens quite regularly when we first start getting some decent sunshine in the spring. The water may go pea green, but that doesn't mean that it's not good, healthy water. It just means that the clarity isn't very good. And it's usually, well, it's always temporary. But more important than the clarity is the chemistry of the water. And once a pond becomes established, as I say, it will become an ecosystem in its own right. And how this happens is that when you dig a new pond, very rapidly, it will get colonized by 2 species of bacteria that are responsible for maintaining the water quality, the water chemistry. The first one of these is a bacteria called Nitrosomonas. And when something grows in the pond and dies, whether it's a plant or an animal, it will break down in the water. It essentially rots. It goes down to the bottom and it rots. So it might be leaf litter or something like that rotting in the pond. What decay is producing is a nitrogenous compound called ammonia. And ammonia is highly toxic to wildlife, to any animals. And it's very important that the amount of ammonia in the water doesn't build up. It doesn't get into any sort of high concentrations or even low concentrations. The ammonia needs to be removed from the water very, very quickly as it's being produced by anything decaying in the water. And it's inevitable that you will have decaying organic compounds in the water. Now, the nitrous amonas bacteria can metabolize ammonia. They essentially get energy by metabolizing ammonia. You can think of ammonia as being food for this species of bacteria. They like it. As soon as ammonia is produced in the water, the nitrous amonas bacteria will metabolize it. And the waste product of them doing that is another nitrogenous compound called nitrite. Nitrite is also quite toxic to wildlife, but nothing like as toxic as ammonia is. But the ammonia is being taken out very quickly as it's being produced by the nitrous amonas. So then you're left with this nitrite. You don't want that to build up. Any sort of high concentrations of nitrite will also kill everything in the pond. But the concentrations can potentially get a little bit higher than the ammonia without causing too much problem. But nevertheless, it needs to be removed. And this second species of bacteria, which is called nitrobacter, they can metabolize nitrite, and they will do. As the nitrite's being produced, these bacteria are metabolizing it, and the waste product of that is another nitrogenous molecule called nitrate. And nitrate isn't as toxic as the other two. And nitrate is also plant food. So nitrate will be getting removed from the water by plant growth. The plants will be taking in the nitrate to support their growth. So you've got this very neat cycle going on in the pond that's catalyzed by these two different species of bacteria. And these bacteria are everywhere. If you dig a pond, they'll just appear in it spontaneously, really. You don't need to introduce them. And they will maintain the quality of the water. So long as you don't lose the bacteria for any reason, then they will maintain the quality of the water. But this equilibrium that you reach, where the water quality is being maintained by these bacteria, can be broken. This cycle can be broken. And there's really two things that often are cause of that. One is the introduction of fish. I already mentioned that fishes aren't really a good combination with a wildlife. But what fishes will do if they are in your pond is two things. One, they will eat everything, and they will eat a lot of the plant life. And if the plant life they don't eat, they quite often uproot. So they spend a lot of time going around the bottom of the pond, turning all the silt over, which will affect the clarity of the water. First of all, you'll get a lot of suspended silt, so you won't be able to, your pond might look a bit like the Severn estuary. But quite apart from that, they'll inhibit the plant life because they'll be eating it. So the nitrates won't be getting taken out by the plants. So fishes can disrupt the equilibrium that your pond will reach. The other thing that can disrupt it is agricultural runoff. And this may be a consideration for where you site your pond as well. If you have a field where, and your pond is sort of downhill of a field where a farmer is putting a lot of nitrogen onto the field, either as chemical nitrates or perhaps even just as spreading dung, because that's going to break down and produce nitrates. When you get a big deluge of rain, if your pond is downhill, you're going to get the runoff, and it's going to get into your pond. And you're introducing a huge amount of nitrate into the pond. And in fact, it may be that you're introducing a huge amount of ammonia. If the farmer's just recently spread the fields, and the dung that he's been using hasn't had time to break down yet, and you end up with a load of dung going in, or any organic matter for that matter, getting into your pond, you may overwhelm your colonies of bacteria and kill them off. because the bacteria populations will be regulated by how much ammonia is being produced in the pond. So if you get a sudden rush of ammonia, then you overwhelm the bacteria, it all dies, and the pond dies. So agricultural runoff and fish can alter the equilibrium in the pond. In fact, any organic matter, there's ponds that get polluted by things like a milk tanker falling over and emptying a load of milk into a pond. You wouldn't think that that in itself would be pollution. But what will happen is that the milk starts to break down because it's an organic product. And so it produces all the ammonia, byproduct of its decay. And so it has the same effect. It'll overwhelm the bacteria in the pond and end up polluting the pond. If it doesn't do that, which is likely that it will, then the other thing that it might do is if you get a lot of nutrients, I'm going to call them nutrients because nitrates are nutrients, if you get a lot of nutrients flowing into the pond, and as a sort of one-off, where you get a huge agricultural runoff with a big deluge of rain or something like that, then as all of this is breaking down in the bottom of the pond, all this excess organic matter, it's using up oxygen because decay uses up oxygen. It needs oxygen for things to decay, and there's limited oxygen in the pond because water doesn't hold as much oxygen as the air does. So what you will find will happen is that the pond becomes deoxygenated, and then you get what's called eutrophication, and again it results in the pond dying. It'll always be temporary. These things are always temporary. Eventually the pond will recover and come back to equilibrium. But it's quite depressing if you lose all of your wildlife in your pond very suddenly, and then it takes a year or something to recover. So that's the chemistry of ponds. The clarity, as I said, is different. There's two things that might affect the clarity of the pond. One is if you've got some sort of stirring up of the silt at the bottom, and this is usually very temporary, unless you've got a fish or something that's stirring up the silt constantly. If you do some work in the pond and it stirs all the silt up, that'll very quickly settle out again, usually within a few days. The other thing that affects the clarity, and I did mention this briefly before, is algal blooms. The ones I'm thinking of here are microscopic algae, which live in the water column, rather than algae that grow on the surfaces. And these microscopic little green algae, if you get enough of them, they turn the water green. As I said, this isn't unhealthy water. In fact, it's very often very healthy water. But you might get these algal blooms where the water turns green early in the spring. And the reason is for that early in the spring, your pond is just emerging from its dormancy. And yet we may get some quite bright sunshine some days. So if you get an extended period of bright sunshine in the early spring, what will happen is that there is quite likely an excess of nutrients in the pond because all of your plants will have died back in the winter and they haven't yet regrown because it's early spring. So these nutrients are sort of available for something else to exploit. When the plants have had a chance to grow, they're going to be taking all of the nutrients out of the water. But when they haven't grown, the algae will take advantage of that. And so given a little bit of bright sunshine, these little tiny microscopic green algae will proliferate and take over, and they turn the water green. But it's nothing to worry about. And what usually happens is after a few days of it being green, you then get a bloom of what they call daphnia, which are water fleas. And water fleas are not actually a flea, they're just called water fleas. They're a little crustacean, but they feed on these microscopic algae. So usually if your water turns green, what happens next is you get a bloom of these little crustaceans, these daphnia, and they'll go around and eat all of these little green microscopic algae, and the water all clears up beautifully again, and then I guess the daphnia population crashes as well, which is fine. Daphnia populations fluctuate wildly anyway. So again, the pond is sorting itself out. So these really are little enclosed ecosystems in their own right. They don't need filtration. They don't need much sort of artificial attention, really. So the next thing is going to be digging your pond. The timing really doesn't matter. You can dig a pond at any time of year. I guess it's usually dictated by the ground conditions, particularly if you're getting an excavator in to do it. But you can dig a pond in the summertime, you can dig it in the wintertime, it really doesn't make very much difference. What you might want to check is ask the utilities companies. They should be able to tell you when you've chosen your spot for putting a pond in, whether there's anything underneath there, any water mains, gas, electric, anything like that. So it's well worth asking the utilities once you've chosen your site, whether it's a safe site to dig. The other thing is spoil disposal. You need to think about this. It may be, there's going to be an awful lot of spoil coming out. So you need to think about how you're going to get rid of this. It may be that you can use it for landscaping. And it may be that you can use it for finding levels, because my next slide is going to be about finding levels for a pond when you start digging. If you're going to have to remove all the spoil from the site, that could become expensive. You probably may have to get a contractor in to do it. You could try and get a local farmer to do it, and often they'd be very happy to spread spoil on their fields or something like that. But we've come unstuck with this because there's really odd licensing laws about removing spoil because it's seen as a hazardous waste. And we've had situations where we've been digging ponds and had farmers take the spoil away for us with the intention of spreading it on their own fields. Although it seems to be classified as hazardous waste, there's actually nothing hazardous about it at all most of the time. That's fine if the farmer who's going to take the spoil away and spread it on his fields owns the field that the spoil is coming from, bizarrely. But if he doesn't own the field where the spoil is coming from, then technically he needs to be licensed to take it away because he's spreading it on somebody else's land. It's a crazy law. It's absolutely mad. But that's just the way it is. And so think about that. Who's going to take the spoil away? Do you need to remove it at all? Perhaps you can build banks or create some sort of landscaping, which would be much easier. But if you do need it to be removed, look into this, because technically you could get on the wrong side of the law, and it could also be very expensive to remove. Somebody once described it when I was having this discussion as, well, if a farmer comes and takes all the spoil away and puts it on his fields, and it's not his spoil in the first place, then it's akin to fly tipping. I don't really agree with that, but that's obviously the way the law looks at it. So it's a very odd one, but just be aware that there is this weird quirk about removing spoil from the site. Once you've dug your excavation, or actually in the process of digging the excavation, you need to pay some attention to the levels. If you're on a very flat piece of ground, then this should be fairly easy. If you're on a bit of a slope, then it's going to be more difficult. There's really two ways of finding the levels to get the top of the pond, the ground level, at the top of the pond level across the pond. If the pond is small enough, if the excavation is small enough, then you can simply lay a plank across from one side of the pond to the other and put a spirit level on it, like this guy in the photograph. If your pond is bigger and it's too large to sort of just lay a plank across it and put a spirit level on, then what works is if you can get your hands on a length of clear hose pipe, plastic hose pipe, but clear so that you can see water inside it. Fill the hose pipe with water, stick a bung in either end, and then if you've got one person at either side of the pond holding the ends of either end of the hose pipe, then when the water is level in the hose pipe at either end of the pond, that means that that's where the level of the pond needs to be. So I don't know whether I described that very well, and I hope you understood that. So it needs to be a clear hose pipe, and it needs to be filled with water, and you need two people. You need one holding either end of the hose pipe, and just putting the hose pipe against the side of the pond so that the water level within the hose pipe is level with the ground surface. And if you can't get the water levels to match, so one or other won't match up with the ground surface, then you're either going to need to build up or dig down on the one side until you can get the water level at either end of the pipe, the hose pipe, matching the ground surface. Until you can get them matching, so that they're both, the water level in the pipe is matching the ground surface at either side of the pond, then it's not level. And it's not something you can do by eye. Believe me, I've tried. And particularly if you're going to use plastic liners and things, it's quite important to get the levels right, because otherwise you might find that you've got a lot of exposed liner on the uphill side. Getting the levels might also be a good way of getting rid of some of the spoil, because if you are on a bit of a slope, you might need to build some sort of a bund on the downhill side of the pond to bring the level up a little bit to get the whole. So those are the two ways that I know of, or I would recommend to get the levels right. But it's worth spending a little bit of time getting the levels right, because if you don't and you put your liner in, it's a much bigger job going back again to do it. So now I'm going to assume that people are going to be lining a pond. If you've got a site where you can put a pond in and it doesn't need lining, then you're very lucky. But most people are going to need to line a pond. So I'm going to just very quickly run through some of the materials that you can use to do this. There's quite a range of stuff that you can use. The first ones are various types of flexible rubbers or plastics. There's three really that I'm going to talk about in a minute. Some people might like molded fiberglass ponds, which are sort of rigid. I'll show you them in a moment, but rigid fiberglass. There's another material called bentonite, which is essentially desiccated clay on a roll. You can use concrete to line a pond, or alternatively, you can puddle clay to line a pond. And I'm going to look at the advantages and disadvantages of each. I'm going to start with this one. This is the molded fiberglass ponds. I don't really recommend them. For one reason, they're very, very small. As you can see, this is probably one of the larger ones, but because of their rigid construction, you can't really get them in large sizes. But they're incredibly difficult to put in because you need to get the excavation exactly the right shape. If you've got voids underneath the ledges, for example, in a molded pond like this, you may find that they end up cracking. They're quite brittle. And I don't think they have very much longevity to them. So I wouldn't really recommend it unless you particularly want one. I think there's better options. A very popular option are these different kinds of plastics and rubber. There's three basically on the market. One is PVC, one is another material called butyl, and then there's this other thing called EPDM. Ethylene propylene diene monomer. Those are the popular ones. They all are sold in the same way. They all come on a roll, as you can see in the picture there, and they come in varying sizes or varying thicknesses. So most people would go for something like 1 millimeter thick, but I think you can go to 1.5, and you may find some companies that do thicker still. They usually have quite long guarantees on them, particularly the butyl and the EPDM. And they're actually quite a suitable material for lining a pond. They're very flexible. They're quite easy to lay, but they do need an underlay. All three of these need an underlay. So if you can lay your hands on some old carpet or something like that, that makes a very good underlay. It just stops them getting punctured by stones and things that might be in the soil underneath. And when the water goes in, there's an awful lot of weight on top of these. So they will bed in and the hot stuff underneath, it'll puncture them. So underlay is quite important. As I say, carpet works quite well, or alternatively sand, but carpet's probably easier to use. I'll look at all three of these individually and start with PVC. PVC is the cheapest option of the three, but it has a lot of disadvantages. It doesn't have very long life expectancy because it gets very brittle. It gets very brittle at low temperature. So in the winter, it starts to get brittle, and it gets very brittle under UV light. So if you get a lot of sunshine in the summer, then that starts to deteriorate, and it doesn't last very long, which is probably why it's the cheapest option. Really, personally, I wouldn't advise it. I think it could be a false economy, and I think it's better to go for either the butyl or the EPDM if a plastic liner is what you want. The other disadvantage of PVC is that it's made with plasticizers, chemicals that they put in to plasticize the material. And this could contain toxins that are going to leach out into the pond. That would only be a temporary problem right at the beginning of the life of the liner. But nevertheless, it's probably one you don't really need. So PVC is an option, and it's a cheap option, but I'm afraid with these things, you rather get what you pay for. Butyl is a very popular choice for lining ponds. It has all sorts of advantages over over PVC. The first is that it's very resistant to temperature fluctuations. So it's resistant down to minus 45 degrees C. We're never going to get a winter that cold. And it's resistant to heat up to 130 degrees C, and I'm afraid we're never going to get a summer that hot. Importantly, it's also resistant to UV light. So sunshine it's not going to deteriorate under intense sunshine. It's quite expensive, which is a bit of a disadvantage. And one of the reasons that it's quite expensive is that it's the choice of material for people who are creating ornamental fish ponds, koi ponds and things like that, because you can do various tricks with butyl, one of which is box welding, what they call box welding. And you can see in the picture here, this guy has created a pond with entirely vertical sides, and what I said about profile before, you'll recognize that for a wildlife pond isn't really appropriate. But for something like a koi pond, it may well be appropriate for keeping koi carp. And this material can be welded to allow it to seamlessly join up on vertical surfaces. It's the only material you can really do that with. And it wouldn't be a necessary technique, I don't think, in any wildlife pond really. But it's because it's so popular, I think, with fish keepers, that probably the supply is, there's more demand, I think, and that probably is why it's the most expensive option. But it is good material, and it's relatively easy to lay. It does need the underlay, as I said, but it usually comes with a lifetime guarantee. I don't know what that really means. I think that probably means that it's going to last 25 years, something like that, and it may last longer. So it's not a bad material. The alternative to it, and slightly cheaper, is EPDM. You can't box weld it, so you can't sort of join pieces and cover vertical surfaces with this as easily as you can with butyl. So it's not as sought after by koi keepers and people like that, and probably for that reason it's a bit cheaper than butyl. But actually, it's just as good. It's as flexible as butyl. It has all of the resistance to temperature fluctuations that butyl has, and actually it has a greater tensile strength than butyl, which might be quite useful. Its disadvantage is obviously you can't box weld it, which probably isn't a disadvantage to somebody creating a wildlife pond, but it's also heavy. It's heavier than butyl, but certainly not a bad option if it's a rubber liner that you're looking for. So those are the three options for plastic and rubber. These options are a little different and have become really very popular amongst pond people. This is a material called bentonite. Bentonite is a type of clay, and you can buy it on a roll, the same as you can buy these rubber liners. It comes on a roll, and what it is a layer of clay, of bentonite clay, that has been ultra desiccated, really, really desiccated, and then rolled into a flat sheet, and then sandwiched between two layers of geosynthetic textile. So it goes down the same way as a rubber liner, but it doesn't need an underlay, which is an advantage. And it's essentially puncture proof, because what happens is it goes down in a roll highly desiccated, and when it gets wet, it expands, and it expands enormously. It expands from a layer that may be just a centimetre or so thick into a layer that may be 30 centimetres thick or more. So massive expansion. That means that if you're using this stuff, you're going to have to make your excavation considerably deeper than you actually want your pond to be. But it has a lot of advantages. The first one, as I say, is that it's essentially puncture proof, because if you puncture it while you're laying it, it just self-seals, because it just expands so much that the clay just seals itself. If you wanted to put pontoons or something into a pond, if you had a sizable pond and wanted to put a pontoon on there that was fixed into the ground, you could do it with bentonite, but you couldn't do it with butyl or something like that. So it's essentially self-sealing. It is quite expensive, and it's really more suitable for larger ponds than it is for small ones. There's several reasons for that. The one is that it's not very flexible, or it's not as flexible as butyl or PVC or EPDM. So you would need very gently sloping sides to lay this stuff, because it's not going to sort of bend very much when you're laying it. But it doesn't need an underlay. The expansion, because it's so huge, as I've already said, means that you're going to have to dig your excavation deeper than your actual pond needs to be. But there is another thing too, which is that you need to put soil on top of it. And you need to put a decent layer of soil on top of it, something like 30 centimetres or a foot of soil on top. So actually your excavation is going to have to be more than a foot deeper than what you want the actual pond to end up being, to allow for, first of all, expansion, but also for the soil on top. The reason you need to put a lot of soil on top is that you need some weight on this stuff, so that when it expands, it doesn't just fall apart. It's got something, it's got some pressure on top of it, something to expand into, if you like. So you need to keep pressure on it. So it needs about 30 centimetres or so of soil on top of it. So you've already got, if you like, a layer of silt in the bottom of the pond. But that's not a problem. We'll see why in a moment. So this is quite popular stuff. It's often used for reservoirs and things like that, but it's just as suitable for ponds. Another option is concrete, usually for the smaller ponds, I would have said. You can sometimes you can do different things with concrete. You could line your pond with butyl or something like that, and then lay concrete over the top of that to provide extra protection for the butyl. Or in certain circumstances, you could just lay concrete straight down onto the excavation, but it would need to be quite thick in that case. If you're going to put concrete over a liner, what I would advise is that you put your liner in and then cover the liner with some chicken wire or something like that, so that you've got something for the concrete to bond onto. If you just lay it straight over a slippery liner, it may not take very well. But if you've got a layer of chicken wire over the top of the liner, then you've got something for the concrete to hold on to. It's very prone to cracking. If you get any ground movement around the pond, then concrete has no flexibility, and so often it just splits and cracks. It's very difficult to fix once that happens. But a lot of people do use it, and a lot of people use it fairly successfully. As I say, whether you're using a liner or not, I would recommend that you line the excavation with chicken wire or some sort of mesh to give the concrete something to bond to. And then you will need a fairly dry mix of concrete. Don't do this on a wet day. And you're essentially just screeding the base of the pond, something about sort of 15 centimeters thick, something like that, 6 inches. So screed the base with concrete, and then with a trowel, just go up the sides. Again, about sort of 15 centimeters thick all around. The sealant comes later. There are some sealants that you can add into the concrete mix, but it's probably easier just to paint on a sealant once you've actually got the concrete in and it's gone off, if you're going to use one of these. So let the concrete dry and then paint a pond sealer onto the top of the concrete. But be aware that the disadvantage of this is, as I say, it cracks very easily. And if it cracks, it's very difficult to repair. This is my personal favorite. This is puddling clay. Puddling clay is the traditional method of sealing ponds, of lining ponds. And it used to be incredibly labor intensive because it was all done by literally puddling it, by stamping on it. What you're aiming to do is to put a decent layer of clay into the bottom of your excavation and squeeze all of the air out. And in past times, what they used to do, some people would get flocks of sheep and stuff like that to run around in the excavation on top of the clay to squeeze all of the air out of it, or they would do it themselves by just literally puddling it, by stamping on it. Nowadays, we're a bit more high tech than that, and what will normally happen is that you would get a tractor with a heavy bucket on the front of it, use the bucket to put the clay into the excavation, and then use the bucket to press it down. So it's not labor intensive anymore. But not any clay will do. You need certain clays, and British Waterways has standards of permeability for clay, so they can advise on which clays are good for puddling. But there's plenty of people around who have experience of doing this, who would be able to advise you where you can get clay from, the right sort of clay. One difficulty is that the clay shouldn't be allowed to dry out, particularly during the work, but actually after the work as well. So if it's going to take a while to puddle, then you may have to get your clay delivered in small batches rather than in one go. But if you're getting it put in by somebody who's got a tractor with a decent bucket on the front, then it would be quite a large pond that you wouldn't be able to puddle in a day. So it would probably be better in that case to have all your clay available in one batch. As I say, the idea is to compress it until all of the air has been squeezed out. So you throw your clay in about 20 centimeters thickness, and then just pressurize it down to squeeze all the air out. And this normally would be done with the front end loader on the tractor. You do need to cover it with soil. So again, your excavation may want to be somewhat deeper than you want the pond to actually end up being. So you need to get soil on top of it fairly quickly to prevent it drying. And you need to get it filling fairly quickly to prevent it drying as well, because if it does dry, what will happen is it starts to crack, and then you've got a whole different problem, really. So keep it damp, keep it wet while you're doing the work. But it's worked for hundreds of years, modeling clay, and a lot of people feel a bit uncomfortable digging a hole that they want to use for conservation of wildlife and then filling it with plastic. So these sort of plastic liners are going out of fashion a little bit. People are going back to perhaps more traditional methods, and I think this is a good one. Okay, so you've dug your excavation, you've lined it with whatever you want to line it with. The next thing is to fill it with water. If you can leave it to fill naturally from rainfall, so much the better. But most people can't, and particularly if you've got a liner in there, whether it's a rubber or plastic liner or even the clay, chances are you're going to have to start filling it straight away, either to hold the liner in place or in the case of clays and things to prevent them cracking. A lot of people will advise against filling it with tap water. The reason being that tap water has quite a lot of nitrates in it. So you're instantly providing a large amount of nutrients into your new pond. And one of the key things about maintaining a pond is to reduce the amount of nutrients that go into it. So it's not ideal to be sticking a load of nutrients into the pond on day one, but sometimes it's unavoidable. And actually it doesn't really matter that much. It might give you a short-term headache, it won't give you a long-term headache. And I'll explain in a minute what the headache's going to be. So my advice would be not to worry too much about people who say, oh, you shouldn't fill it from the tap, because it may be your only choice. If you have alternatives, then so much the better, but a lot of us don't have. The other thing you're going to do is to introduce a lot of nutrients in the soils that you put in. So as I've said, if you've got clays and things like that, they're going to have a layer of soil put on top of them. Again, try and use soil that contains fewer nutrients. So if you've got the option of using subsoil to lay in as your first sort of substrate in the bottom of your pond, use it in preference to topsoil, because topsoil will have a lot more organic matter in it that is going to break down and produce a lot of nutrients early on. The reason why I'm saying that you don't want to introduce a lot of nutrients early on is because ponds mature over time, and the early stages of succession up to maturation are quite startling anyway. You're going to get a lot of algal blooms, and you're going to get all sorts of things that are going to make you think, why on earth did I even think of digging a pond? I'm going to tell you in a little while that you don't actually need to worry about them, although it may be difficult to persuade you that, but you don't. But by introducing a lot of nutrients early, you're going to get greater blooms of algae in those early stages than you would if you can reduce the amount of nutrients. So if you've got an option to use something other than tap water, excellent. If you haven't, don't worry. If you've got to put soil into the pond, then use subsoil in preference to topsoil to reduce the amount of nutrients going in straight away. So this is the pond as an ecosystem. So ponds take time to mature. I would say that they take a minimum of a decade, 10 years to mature. During that process of maturation, they go through phases of succession. I spoke about them earlier, looking at the long-term picture, where a pond goes from a big, deep hole to nothing at all. But now I'm talking about phases of succession just in the early life of a pond, when you first put it in. So the early phases can be quite alarming. The key thing is not to panic, okay? The early phases of succession in a pond involve algae, lots of algal blooms. And they put their pond in, and on day one, it looks absolutely pristine and spectacular. And then 6 weeks later, it's full of algae. this horrible stringy blanket weed that takes over everything and fills the pond up and throttles any plants that you've tried to put in. And you can't get rid of this stuff. And people get terribly frustrated by it. And my advice is, don't worry about it. There's masses of information you're going to be able to find, particularly on the internet, that will tell you how you can get rid of blanket weed in your pond. But none of them work. People go to great lengths with a split bamboo to twist it out on the end of the bamboo, but it all comes back. People throw bales of barley straw in the water because you'll hear that barley straw will get rid of blanket. It does, but it does so very temporarily. The reason you're getting blooms of algae is because the pond hasn't reached any equilibrium. And so you have no plants because the pond is brand new. So the plants aren't taking any nutrients out of the water. So the algae have got the field to themselves, really. All the nutrients that are in the pond that aren't being taken out by the plants, the algae are going to take advantage of that, and they're going to thrive. So it takes a little while to get the plants you want, the macrophytes, established in the pond. But once they are, then they're going to be competing with these algae for the available nutrients. So if you can keep the amount of nutrients down and encourage the plants that you want to grow, then you're going to get eventually a situation where those plants are out competing the algae for the available nutrients. Now, it takes a little while to get there. I'm going to try and suggest ways that you might accelerate this maturation process, but you're going to have to go through it. There is no alternative. So if you get huge algal blooms, do not worry. From the wildlife perspective, they make no difference at all. Wildlife don't care about algae. They love algae. It provides cover for newts and things like that. It's only us that don't like algae because we think it's unsightly, but it's actually perfectly healthy stuff. So don't worry about it. Don't throw great big bales of barley straw in the pond, because what happens is if you put barley straw in the pond, it does seem to suppress the growth of algae for a little while, because there's tannins in barley straw that get released into the water. And that does seem to have an effect on the growth of algae, but it's only a temporary one, because eventually the barley straw is going to start breaking down in the water, and that's going to be releasing even more nutrients than you started with. And then you'll get an even bigger bloom of algae. So all of the things that you might hear about how to get rid of it are mostly snake oil, and I wouldn't worry about it really. You just have to sort of grit your teeth and go through it and try and accelerate the maturation process rather than trying to prevent it happening. The easiest way to accelerate it is to plant quite heavily when you first put your pond in, plant plants you want. But the thing is with planting is that if you plant pond weeds, the sort of submerged oxygenating weeds, they're going to likely get smothered by blanket weed fairly quickly. So what I would suggest is, rather than planting them, plant the emergent plants, the ones that are in the shallow water, the ones around the edges, the irises and things like that. Because they're going to be taking nutrients out of the water, but they're not going to get smothered by the algae because most of their growth is above the waterline. Once they've started to flourish, then might be the time to start introducing the pond weeds and the oxygenators. And I don't know whether I forgot to say this, but right at the very beginning of this talk, I did say to you that there are two ways that oxygen gets into your pond. By far the most important one is by diffusion of oxygen from the air into the water at the surface. The second one is through pond plants, little plants that are living below the surface of the water, photosynthesizing. It's a far smaller source of oxygen for the pond, but it is another source of oxygen for the pond. So oxygenating pond plants are quite important. but putting them in too early is going to just depress you, because they're going to get overwhelmed by these algal blooms, and there's really not a lot you can do about that. But if you plant heavily with the emergence first, then you're going to start the process of competing with the algae for the available nutrients. And once that process is starting, then once the algae starts losing that battle, then you can plant the bomb plants. So that's really the only way that you can accelerate the maturation process, is just get that battle going early between the macrophytes, the plants you want, and the algae for the available nutrients. And of course, preventing nutrients getting into the water in the first place. So if you've got something that's decaying in there and you can avoid it, then avoid it. So for example, at the end of each season, in the autumn, when all of the emergent plants start to die back, rather than letting them just all collapse into the water and rot, cut them off and get rid of them, put them on your compost heap or something like that. And you prevent an awful lot of the nutrient release into the water just by doing that. So here we are. What to plant? Okay, well, the first question that a lot of people ask is whether it's necessary to plant in the first place, or should they just dig their hole and leave it to colonize naturally? There's nothing wrong with leaving it to colonize naturally, and over time you would get a lot of native species moving in, particularly if you've got birds like ducks or herons or something visiting the pond. They'll bring pond weeds and things with them, tied up in their toes, snarled up in their toes. But what I just explained to you about these phases of succession, if you want to accelerate them, then you're going to probably need to plant. If the pond you've dug doesn't have any sort of ornamental role, and you just want a natural pond, then there's nothing wrong with leaving it and letting it colonize naturally with plants, but it'll take some time. So planting is important from the perspective of accelerating the maturation process, and really it's purely cosmetic. It's what it pleases us rather than the wildlife. It makes no difference at all to the wildlife. In the deep water, the sort of plants you're going to have are the submerged oxygenating ones, the pond weeds, and lilies. They do well in deep open water. And in the shallow water, you're going to have emergence, the rushes and the irises and things like that. The next question people always ask is, should they be native or can you use foreigners? Again, it doesn't really matter. If you're a purist and you like native plants and you want your wildlife pond to be representative of a British natural pond, then you're going to want to stock it simply with natives. But again, from the wildlife perspective, it really doesn't make very much difference if you're introducing ornamental plants. For example, we have the yellow flag iris as a native plant, but there's all sorts of varieties of irises which aren't native, they're cultured. But if you prefer them, then there's nothing wrong with planting them. From the wildlife perspective, there's nothing wrong with planting them. From the water quality perspective, there's nothing wrong with planting them. So I don't get hung up about this, but a lot of people do. And a lot of people would prefer just natives, which is also fine. Where you source your plants is quite important. Particularly if you're somebody who wants to just source native plants. A lot of things are sold as natives, which aren't actually natives. They're varieties of natives. I'm going to give a plug to a company that I think is very good in Castle Carey, called Habitat Aid. The reason I think they're good is because they're a not-for-profit, and they put their profit into conservation work for habitats, to create habitats, which I'm all in favour of, some of which of course are ponds, and they sell quite a range of native pond plants. They don't sell anything that's not So they're pretty good, and I'll plug them again at the end. There are some plants that you should avoid. There's some plants that have been sold for years in garden centres and things like that, which are now illegal. They can't be sold anymore because they have become invasives. Most of them are American plants. Parrot feather is one. I think I gave Lila a list of suitable plants for planting in your ponds. It's not comprehensive at all, but I think Lila's going to circulate it after this talk. So you will get more information on potential plants that you can use. And as I say, please don't shout at me if there's something that's not on there that you think should be, because I don't claim it to be comprehensive. But it has just native plants on it, and quite a nice selection to get you going. And on there as well are 5 species that if you see them being sold, don't accept it, don't take them, because it should be illegal to sell them, but I think they are still sold in some places. Some of them are really invasive. There's something called Australian stonecrop, or sometimes called New Zealand stonecrop, and a lot of wild ponds have been invaded by this species. And it literally takes over the pond, and it grows throughout all the levels of the water column from the bottom right up to the top, and it just completely clogs the ponds. And it creates all sorts of problems for water quality because it all breaks down in the autumn, and so you've got this massive amount of organic matter breaking down in the pond and creating huge amounts of nutrients, which in turn is going to lead to larger either large algal blooms or an even greater density of Australian stonecrop growing the next year. So these sort of plants need to be avoided. That's kind of the worst, but there's others as well. Parrot feather, we have even on the Somerset Wildlife Trust reserves down on the Somerset levels, West Hay. Parrot feather is a non-native that's invasive. How it got onto West Hay Reserve, I don't know, but some of the smaller water bodies, the reams and the ditches and things are quite covered in it. So be aware that there are some plants to avoid, and they're on the piece of the sheet of paper that I think Lila will be circulating. But other than those, there are no rules. Okay, the rules are your own. Either you like ornamental varieties, or you like to keep strictly to the natives, which are also very ornamental and pretty. Don't get me wrong, but from the wildlife perspective, it doesn't matter. It only matters from the human perspective. It's purely cosmetic. So how can you expect wildlife to colonize? Well, different species prefer different phases of succession. There are some animals that will be typically early colonizers. Those things that can fly in are likely to be the first things that arrive. So water beetles, dragonflies, caddisflies, all manner of flies really are likely to come in fairly early on. Water boatmen, beetles, things like that. Stuff that flies are going to be the first. If you've got amphibians already in the vicinity where you live, then they might turn up fairly quickly. Amphibians can smell ponds, or more specifically, they smell the algae growing in ponds. So they're quite good at finding them. So usually they'll turn up within the first couple of years. What I would urge everybody is to avoid moving stuff from one pond to another. I've said here avoid moving animals from one pond to another, but I would add to that avoid moving plants from one pond to another, particularly what you might describe as the ornamental plants. There was somebody that we dug a pond for a few years ago, and he very proudly, a few days later, showed me this great big water butt full of plants that he had been given by somebody from their pond, and said, oh, look at this, they've given me this huge, great big variety of plants to plant up my new pond. Luckily, he showed them to me before he planted them in the pond, because what we discovered was that there was fragments of this Australian stonecrop wrapped up amongst the roots of the plants. And had he put it in the pond, we wouldn't have known that until the whole thing was overtaken by this invasive plant. So be a little bit careful about moving things around, and particularly animals. I would say particularly amphibians. Amphibians are struggling at the moment because there's an awful lot of emerging diseases of amphibians, some of which are quite serious actually. And it may not be easy to tell whether you've got a disease of amphibians in a pond that you're introducing to yours. A lot of people move tadpoles, and I would suggest that that's not a good practice. Please don't go and catch tadpoles in some other pond and put them in yours, because you might be spreading disease. The chances may be slim, but nevertheless, the risk is there of spreading disease. So ideally, don't introduce anything, any animals, just let them colonize themselves. And if they live in the vicinity of where your pond is, they will come. You know what they say? Build it and they will come. And that applies to ponds. So you've got your pond, you've got your plants, you've got your animals moving in. The next question is going to be about maintenance. Now, what you can see in the picture here is the sort of maintenance that you really want to avoid. I mentioned about ponds going through this maturation process, which takes quite a long time. If you just leave your pond for a decade and then think, my God, I've got an awful lot of silt and rubbish in this pond, I need to drain it down and clear it out completely. What you're actually doing is taking your pond right back to the beginning. So then you start your maturation process all over again. By doing little and often, as far as maintenance is concerned, it's much better than doing a massive, great big job like this. So what I would suggest, and the maintenance in a pond is all about preventing nutrients from getting into the pond in the first place, as far as you can. You're not going to be able to prevent it altogether. There's always going to be decay in a pond. There's always going to be nutrients being released into a pond. And of course, that's a good thing because the plants need it. What you want is to avoid excess nutrients, which is why I said right at the beginning that it's a good idea not to put your pond under overhanging trees, because that's going to introduce a huge amount of excess nutrients every autumn when the leaves fall. But what I would suggest is sort of fairly light touch maintenance every autumn at the end of each season, and any plant life that is dying back. Particularly easy is to get the emergence. Instead of allowing it all to fall into the pond and decay, cut it down and remove all of the cuttings and put them on your composting. If you do that, you're preventing a lot of silt buildup, you're preventing a lot of nutrients entering the water, and it's really all you need to do. Eventually, there's going to come a time where perhaps you need to start getting silt out of the bottom of the pond. But that's not going to be for a very, very long time. If you just do this little bit of maintenance work, little and often, it's great. It'll keep the pond going for a very long time, and it'll control the nutrients entering the water. The other thing to say about maintenance is if you do any maintenance work on a pond, please always do it in the winter, or at least in the autumn. During summer, the pond is heaving with life, and in the wintertime, the pond goes completely dormant. So that is the time to do maintenance on a pond, is in the winter. I usually do the maintenance on mine here around about Christmas time, and cut all of the emergent vegetation, and perhaps take out some of the pond plants, the oxygenators that are dying back in the bottom, just net them out. But I do it right in the middle of winter, and that's the best time to do it because it's when you've got the least life in the pond. Doesn't mean you have no life in the pond. Some things will overwinter in the pond. So when you're messing around in the pond doing maintenance work in the middle of winter, you may well disturb amphibians that are hibernating in the bottom. Don't worry about that. They'll go straight back into hibernation when you finish doing your work in the pond. They'll go straight back down into the bottom of the pond and bury themselves in the mud again. But you may, if you're pulling out a lot of material from the pond, you may take out quite a lot of wildlife with it, particularly invertebrates and things. So some of the snails obviously overwinter in the pond. Dragonfly larvae have more than a 1-year cycle, so the larvae are in the pond over the winter. These sort of things get pulled out with all of the plant life that you're pulling out. So what I suggest is that you pile up the cuttings and the plants that you're pulling out on the side of the pond for a day or two, just to give things an opportunity to crawl back in again. And once they do, they'll go back in and they'll become dormant again fairly quickly. And that is that, really. The last thing is that I have here some further information if you want to follow it up. The Freshwater Habitats Trust have an excellent website on pond creation. You'll get an awful lot of information from them. If you're interested in that clay liner that I mentioned, the clay is called bentonite, and there are a couple of websites there where you will get more information and find suppliers. And lastly, if it's native plants you want, I did already give a plug to Habitat Aid. They're local. They do great stuff. They've given us plants for the Mendip Pond project, so I have to give them a plug. But they are a not-for-profit, and they raise their money by selling not just pond plants, but meadow plants and everything else. What you can guarantee with them is that you're going to get natives rather than native species that have been sourced overseas, which is often the case. And there you are. Does anybody have any questions?
Oh, John, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. There are a number of questions, in fact, that have come in the chat, but yes. But yeah, a huge amount of information in that. That was really useful. Do you have, how much time do you have to answer questions? We might have about 15 or so.
As long as you want. Can I just go and turn my light on? I'm sitting in the dingy in here.
Sure, of course. I'm just going to open a document that Pippa has created. She's been compiling them all for me, so I can read them out to you.
Do you want me to stop sharing my screen, Lila?
Yeah, sure, go for it. Lovely. Right. That's brilliant. Thanks so much, John. So, questions that we have for you. If you are digging a pond into the ground that is naturally clay, would this usually hold the water?
It's a difficult one to answer. It depends on the density of the clay. Theoretically, it could, yes. But there's been a lot of people I've known who have said, oh, I've dug a pond into clay and it will hold water. And then they've subsequently found that it doesn't. Now, that may not be a problem because you can go ahead and line it once you discover, if you do discover that it won't actually hold water. Often they'll hold water or they'll become seasonal ponds. They'll hold water for most of the summer, but maybe not for all of it. If you're on very dense clay, then there's a good chance that it might hold water all year. But a lot of, as I say, a lot of people end up having to line these ponds eventually.
Sure, no, I've heard that, certainly. Another question is, what do you think about using loose bentonite clay mixed with soil as a liner?
What do I think about using bentonite clay?
Loose bentonite clay mixed with soil as a liner.
Bentonite clay and soil.
That was the question, yes.
I know. I'm not quite sure what that's implying, but I think I know. Bentonite clay can come as a roll, or bentonite clay can be bought as little granules.
Right.
And often people scatter granules onto the soil at the bottom of the excavation. I don't advise it. I've never done it, so I don't know, but I believe that it's not terribly successful. The idea being that if you scatter a big enough layer of granules, that they're all going to swell up and they're all going to seal into a watertight clay liner. It may work in certain circumstances, and the granules are obviously quite useful, or not obviously, the granules are quite useful for joining rolls of bentonite clay together. You can just scatter the granules on the edge of one roll and overlap the other roll, and as they swell, they'll attach two rolls. But as a way of creating a liner from scratch, I don't think it would be very successful. I don't think it's generally recommended. I think more recommended is to actually put the bentonite roll there. I'm not sure whether that answers the question, but
makes sense. Yeah. All right. Brilliant. Thanks, John. Another question: we are restoring a small area of woodland on a hill. Can I put a shallow pond scrape where there hasn't already been any water, creating a new wet area? And how deep should it be, and will anything come? I mean, you probably answered a lot of that already in your talk. And there's a comment from an attendee: wet woodlands are a very valuable habitat. And you've recommended to try Woodland Trust and Sussex Wildlife Trust. They've got a PDF on how to create and restore wet woodlands. So she's almost creating a kind of a wet woodland habitat by doing that, which sounds brilliant.
yeah.
Yeah. Anything to add, or shall I move on?
Only that wet woodland's fine. It'll just create a completely different type of pond. Woodland ponds tend to be very high in nutrients. And you get relatively few, despite being high in nutrients, you get relatively few algal blooms because there's not a lot of light. So you've got a huge leaf fall, not much light. Often this leaves the pond, at least in comparison to the ones I've been talking about, it might leave it rather what's the opposite of biodiverse? Impoverished. So you get less life, but that doesn't mean you don't get any. You get a different suite of species in a woodland pond.
Sure, that's brilliant, thanks. All right, so somebody's asked, I'm wondering the same on our agricultural land, but without requiring planning permission, where the land dips away due to open cast mining in the past, but only holds water in heavy rain. Any comment?
Planning permission for where's the pond going?
Where the land dips away due to open cast mining in the past, but only holds water in heavy rain.
I'm not sure, but I would advise that anybody go and ask the council about planning permission.
Not a really good idea. If you're not sure about planning permission, it's better to ask, isn't it?
I think so. Be on the safe side.
All right, brilliant. A question from Rich. I've created what I hoped would be a wildlife pond in my back garden using a new galvanized 4-foot water trough. I've had the pond for coming up to a year and I've seen very little sign of wildlife enjoying it, other than bathing birds, and the plants look like they may be struggling, especially the oxygenators and the lily. Having looked online, I can see mixed reviews regarding galvanized troughs due to the zinc entering the water. Have I made a big error by using galvanized trough as a liner, or can this be successful, and do I just need to be patient?
I think you probably just need to be patient. A galvanized trough isn't the perfect thing to make a pond out of, simply because you've got vertical sides. Is this sunk into the ground, or is it sitting proud of the ground?
He hasn't specified that.
If it's sunk into the ground, my worry would be that things would drown in there. Blundering hedgehogs have a habit of falling into ponds. They need a way out. But I think from the purpose of maturation, what is really what the question's about, isn't it? And I suspect that it's just a question of patience.
All right, that's useful. Let's see, scrolling down. Claire asks, we would also like to make a rain garden making use of a seasonal watercourse that runs across our field, essentially a shallow gully lined with stones and plants. Will this encourage wildlife?
Well, it will, but it won't be the sort of pond that I've been describing. It won't be. If you've got running water, it changes the character in a big way. One of the things that changes is that you may introduce animals that you don't want. So it's possible that you might have small fishes, bullheads or sticklebacks or something in a small stream. But also it creates a silt trap. So you will get very, very shallow water very quickly. And it won't really provide much habitat for a large number of species. You won't get the maximum number of species that you could get if you had a discrete pond. Most of these animals like a discrete pond. Once you've got running water, it changes the character of it as well.
Brilliant. Another question, we have a lot of voles and moles. Are they known to do damage to pond liners?
Voles won't, moles might. My guess is they probably won't. I think they would, it depends on the liner, of course, but my guess is that they would find that they hit something fairly solid and probably dig around it. Voles certainly won't, and I've never heard of moles puncturing a liner, but I guess there's the potential for it. But if they did, they're going to get swept right out of their tunnel very quickly, I should imagine. I've never heard of it happen. I don't think it's like.
Oh, that's good to know. That would be a shock. All right. Another question about spirit levels. Can you use a spirit level on a plank for finding the level of the pond?
Yeah, it's if the pond's narrow enough, if the two banks are close enough that you can put a plank across from one side to the other and put a spirit level on it, and that works perfectly well. If you've got a bigger pond, then you're not going to be able to do that.
All right, brilliant. Catherine's asked, interesting to hear about the oxygenating plants. Oh, this is probably already covered, actually. Should we remove everything green floating on the surface? I think you've covered that, haven't you?
Kind of. Get the marginals established first is probably the best thing. Mm-hmm. Because as you go through those early stages of succession, you're going to find that the small oxygenators are likely to get throttled by algal blooms, really, by blanket weed. If you can get the marginals established first, so that they start to compete with the algae, then that's probably the time to start introducing the oxygenators. Otherwise, you're just going to lose faith in it, because you're going to be putting all these plants in, they're just going to be getting destroyed.
Sure, no, absolutely. And one that you've probably covered already, can you talk about managing the growth of unwanted weed? You probably covered that already.
Sorry, can you say that again, Lila?
Can you talk about the managing the growth of unwanted weed?
Of unwanted weed?
Unwanted weeds, yeah.
Managing the growth of unwanted weed. I guess the only thing you can do, it depends a little bit on why the weed is unwanted. If it's a native
invasive?
weed, sorry?
It was an invasive, perhaps?
Perhaps. I was going to say, if it's a native, then perhaps it shouldn't be unwanted. But if it's an invasive, then the only thing you're going to be able to do, really, is to drain the pond and start again. A lot of these things can grow from the tiniest fragment. And so you can go to huge pains to rake out everything that you can and find that actually it was to no avail at all. It all comes back the next year. So if you've got an invasive like, I don't know, like parrot feather or Australian stonecrop or one of the others, really the only thing you can do is to drain the pond and let the whole thing dry out for a while. And then you're essentially starting from scratch. I can't really see any other useful way.
Absolutely. All right, brilliant. Thanks so much, John. I'll probably have to leave it there for now. I think there's a few extra questions that have come into the chat box.
I can see the chat box actually.
Can you? Right, okay. I mean, if you've got any time to answer the last few questions, we could carry on. Let's see, lots of people saying thank you.
One about fairy shrimps that I think
yes,
probably needs an answer.
Oh, sure.
The question is, how should you maintain a temporary pond? Does it matter if it doesn't fill each year? Should the grass be cut, and should we dig some parts each year? There are fairy shrimp in the pond. Fairy shrimp are worth conserving. They are a red data book species. So my advice would be to do, in fact, more or less as little as possible to this pond. Fairy shrimps are specialized for temporary ponds, so the fact that it's temporary is a good thing in this case, because it's supporting an unusual species. So I wouldn't dig it out further. I would leave it as it is and just maintain it the way it is. I'm not sure what you mean by the grass being cut, but if that means the grass around the edge of the pond, then yes, there's no harm in cutting that. I can't see that that's going to affect anything really. But I think maintenance is trying to hold it as it is, rather than allowing it to change too much, if you want to maintain the fairy shrimps. And I think they're worth maintaining.
I agree, definitely, they're wonderful creatures, aren't they? All right, well, are there any others that you feel that you'd like to answer? Should we could ping out an email to everyone next week with any unanswered questions.
There is one about aeration.
Oh yes.
Aeration won't necessarily, it asks, does aeration of the water help advance maturation by keeping the water oxygenated? The simple answer is no, it won't advance maturation, but water does need to be oxygenated. Providing aeration of the water, the pond water can only hold so much oxygen. It very quickly gets saturated in oxygen. So providing additional aeration doesn't necessarily oxygenate the water any further. It does keep the water moving, it circulates the water, so it may disperse oxygen more evenly across the pond, but it's not a lack of oxygen that's causing the algal blooms that you get in the early parts of the development of the pond. So increasing oxygenation isn't necessarily going to help. It's not going to probably make much difference. And if your pond is properly designed and you have the correct surface area to depth ratio, then actually you should find that your pond has a saturation of oxygen anyway, I would think.
Brilliant. Oh, thanks so much, John. That is absolutely amazing. I've just learned loads. And thank you everyone for coming along tonight as well and for asking all these very interesting questions. And lots of people saying in the chat, you know, really useful talk. Lots of people are inspired, so I think we'll get a few photographs sent to us of ponds hopefully this coming year.
If people can I just say, Lila, if people want to contact me outside of this talk, my contact details are on the RAGS website, so people can email me with questions if they want to.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's really kind. Thank you, John. And also just to say that we will be putting a recording of this up on the SWT TV page on our website. It'll be in the training section. There's quite a few videos up there already. So this will go with that, and I can send out a link probably next week now. And also I'll send that PDF with the plants that you recommend. And yes, I guess that's probably it. We'll probably wrap it up there. Thank you again and have a lovely rest of the evening. Really good to see you, John, and everyone.
Thank you, John. Amazing talk. So thank you so much for all your time. It's been really brilliant. So, and thank you everyone for your kind comments as well. So it's great to see you all. But thank you very much.
Take care.